a rain-soaked night in the heart of Chicago, under a sky split by restless lightning, a worn grocery cart creaked along a cracked sidewalk. Pushing it with stiff, tired arms was Malcolm Reed, a 34-year-old black single father, whose every step sounded like a silent prayer for mercy. At his side, clinging to his patched jacket, was little Emma Reed, only 7 years old, her tiny pink boots splashing in the swelling puddles. The city's breath was cold and merciless, howling between empty buildings, whispering of doors forever closed and opportunities denied. Malcolm's world had narrowed to the essentials: survive tonight, find shelter before dawn, keep hope alive in Emma's innocent heart. No steady job, no home to return to, only fleeting shifts at a greasy kitchen washing dishes, the thin thread keeping them from falling into the chasm entirely. His last paycheck was already spent, and the eviction notice tucked in his bag felt heavier than any storm. Then, as they turned a battered corner near an abandoned storefront, Emma's bright voice, still untouched by the cruelty of the world, sliced through the wind. "Daddy, look," she cried, pointing with a small, trembling hand. Across the street, gleaming under the flickering street lamp, was a silver BMW, its hazard lights blinking frantically in the darkness. Standing beside it was a woman, probably in her early 40s, struggling to wrestle a flimsy, battered umbrella against the storm. One hand clutched her cell phone, and frustration radiated off her rigid posture like a second skin. Malcolm hesitated. Ahead lay the diner, the promise of a few hours of dishwashing, a little money to stretch their survival one more day. Every logical voice in his mind screamed at him to keep walking. He couldn't afford delays. He couldn't afford mistakes. But when he looked down and met Emma's wide brown eyes, filled not with fear but with a boundless, instinctive compassion, the decision was ripped from his hands. Her small fingers tugged at his sleeve, her whisper barely audible over the storm. "Maybe we can help her, Daddy." Malcolm exhaled, the breath steaming from his lips into the cold, uncaring night. His body ached from fatigue, his spirit from years of invisible battles lost before they began. Still, he forced a smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "All right, Peanut," he said gently. "Let's go see." Hand in hand they crossed the flooded street, the rain soaking through their worn clothes within seconds. The woman turned as they approached, her pale face framed by wet blonde strands sticking to her forehead. She wore a tailored navy coat that screamed of wealth and importance, a striking contrast to Malcolm's threadbare jeans and Emma's oversized jacket patched with mismatched fabric. As Malcolm raised a hand in greeting, offering a tentative smile, he saw it. The flicker in her eyes, the quick calculation, suspicion, fear, judgment. He knew it too well. A black man, ragged, approaching a stranded white woman at night. History had written this scene too many times, and it never ended in kindness. Still, Malcolm swallowed his pride. His voice, roughened by cold and countless disappointments, was steady. "Flat tire." The woman's fingers tightened on her phone. "Yes," she said curtly. "I called roadside assistance, but they're taking forever." "I can change it for you," Malcolm offered before she could say more, cutting through the tight rope of distrust strung between them. He didn't expect her to trust him. He didn't need her to. He just needed to be the man his daughter still believed he was. Before the woman could find words, Emma bounced forward, holding up their battered umbrella over Malcolm with both hands, beaming. "My daddy's really good at fixing things," she chirped, the earnestness in her voice a salve against the icy rain. "He says being kind is free, so we should always share it." The woman hesitated, then let out a short, breathless chuckle, more from surprise than amusement. Malcolm got to work, kneeling on the wet asphalt, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones. 15 minutes later, the tire was replaced, and the woman, fumbling through her soaked purse, tried to hand him a crisp $100 bill. Malcolm shook his head firmly. "No need," he said quietly. "Just happy to help." She stared at him, confusion flickering through her guarded eyes, then offered something different. A ride, perhaps a gesture of gratitude or guilt. Malcolm hesitated, then agreed for Emma's sake, not knowing the storm they were walking into was far greater than the rain swirling around them. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable chair, maybe a warm drink by your side, and prepare yourself. What you are about to hear isn't just a story about changing a tire. It's about the fragile bridges between judgment and grace, about dignity in the face of suspicion, and how a single act of kindness can ripple further than anyone dares to imagine. The rain intensified as Malcolm and Emma reached the stranded car, a roaring white noise that blurred the edges of the world into a watercolor of silver, black, and bruised purples. The woman, whose tailored coat was no match for the deluge, glanced up from her phone, her blue eyes sharp with frustration before quickly clouding with suspicion. Malcolm caught it immediately, the tightening grip on her umbrella, the quick check over her shoulder, the rigid squaring of her stance. It was always the same look. He slowed his approach, deliberately keeping his hands visible, offering the universal gesture of peace. An open palm raised shoulder high. Emma, undeterred by the subtle tension, hopped cheerfully beside him, her umbrella tilting dangerously under the assault of the storm. "I can help," Malcolm said, his voice low, unthreatening, pitched just enough to carry over the storm but not enough to startle. The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. For a moment, only the drumming rain answered. Then, after a heartbeat of hesitation, she stepped back, gesturing awkwardly toward the car. "Flat tire," she said curtly. Malcolm nodded, crouching beside the sleek machine. Water streamed down his neck, soaking the collar of his already drenched jacket, but he ignored it. His fingers, though stiff with cold, moved with the ease of long habit. Unseen by him, Emma shifted to hold the battered umbrella over his head, her tiny arms straining against the wind. "My daddy's really good at fixing things," she chirped again, glancing up at the woman with a gap-toothed grin. "He says kindness is free." The woman offered a tight, uneasy smile, her knuckles whitening around the handle of her umbrella, but she said nothing more. Malcolm worked quickly. The tire was jammed tight, slick with rain and grime, but he leveraged his body weight skillfully, drawing on muscles hardened by years of manual labor. The wind howled down the empty street, tugging at his clothes, slamming the umbrella sideways with a crack of fabric that made Emma squeal and giggle all at once. 15 minutes later, with a grunt and a final twist of the wrench, the spare tire clicked into place. Malcolm wiped his hands on his jeans, smearing grease and grit into the soaked denim. He stood, rolling his shoulders, feeling the deep grinding ache in his lower back. The familiar payment for a job done. The woman fumbled through her purse, her fingers trembling, pulling out a $100 bill. She extended it toward him stiffly, like one might extend food to a wild animal. Malcolm looked at the money, then up at her. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, everything unsaid hung heavy between them. The assumptions, the fear, the unbridgeable chasm of lived experiences. "No need," he said simply, stepping back. "Just happy to help." The woman blinked, genuinely startled. Her arm wavered, then dropped. The money sagged in her hand. "At least," she began, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Let me give you a ride. You're soaked." Malcolm hesitated. Every fiber of his pride screamed at him to refuse, but then he glanced at Emma, shivering in her damp jacket, her lips tinged a worrying shade of blue. "Good enough." "All right," he said finally, his voice rough. Thanks. The woman nodded briskly, almost as if relieved. She unlocked the car doors with a beep, and they clambered into the warm, leather-scented cocoon of the BMW. Inside, the world changed. The roar of the rain doled to a gentle drumbeat on the roof. The heated seats thawed the numbness from Malcolm's fingers. Emma, wide-eyed, bounced slightly in the plush back seat, her wonder unfiltered and pure. "I'm Eleanor Hart," the woman said after a moment, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Malcolm stiffened. The name hit him like a slap. He'd seen it on magazine covers, billboards, news snippets in diners and waiting rooms. Eleanor Hart, CEO of Hart Automotive, one of the fastest-growing electric vehicle manufacturers in the country. A woman who moved billions with a signature, who likely hadn't had to change her own tire in decades. And yet here she was, ferrying a dishwater-wet mechanic and his daughter through a Chicago storm. "Malcolm Reed," he said finally, voice carefully neutral. He offered no titles, no explanations. Let her assume what she would. Eleanor nodded once, businesslike. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Emma broke it first, chattering about how her daddy could fix anything, about how they helped stray cats sometimes, about how kindness made the world better. Her words tumbled out in an endless, sunbright stream. Eleanor listened, one hand on the wheel, her expression unreadable. But Malcolm noticed the small things, the way her jaw unclenched, the way her grip on the wheel softened, the way her gaze flicked toward the rearview mirror just a little more often. When they pulled up outside a dingy diner, little more than a flickering neon sign and a crumbling brick facade, Malcolm moved to get out, but Eleanor stopped him with a sharp look. "Give me your number," she said. Malcolm hesitated. "In case I have another flat," she added, almost as an afterthought. He dug a crumpled scrap of paper from his pocket, scribbled his number with a half-broken pen, and handed it to her. No expectations, no hope. He'd played this game before. Rich folks made promises like leaves in the wind. Abundant, pretty, and ultimately meaningless. "Take care," Eleanor said, her voice low. "You too," Malcolm replied. He slammed the door against the storm and watched her taillights vanish into the rain. The diner was half empty, the sour smell of old grease clinging to the walls. Malcolm paid for coffee he couldn't afford and sat with Emma in a cracked vinyl booth, their wet clothes steaming slightly in the weak heat. Hours dragged by. No calls came. Days blurred into one another, each colder and harder than the last. Malcolm hustled for work, fixing appliances, patching roofs, anything for cash. But jobs were scarce, and kindness didn't pay the rent. The eviction came like a guillotine. Swift, brutal, leaving no room for protest. One morning they were tenants. By nightfall, they were trespassers. The car became their home. Emma, resilient beyond her years, built forts from blankets and declared it an adventure. Malcolm smiled and played along, hiding the terror gnawing at his gut. The phone stayed silent. 2 weeks later, when the screen finally lit up with an unknown number, Malcolm almost didn't answer. "Mr. Reed." The voice was smooth, commanding. "This is Eleanor Hart." The phone trembled in Malcolm's cracked palm, as if the device itself understood the weight of the moment. Rain still hammered the roof of the abandoned parking garage where he had parked for the night, each drop a sharp note in a relentless symphony of despair. "Mr. Reed?" the voice repeated, smooth yet edged with authority. "This is Eleanor Hart." For a beat, Malcolm couldn't find his voice. Emma, curled in a tangle of worn blankets in the back seat, stirred slightly but did not wake. Malcolm pressed the phone tighter against his ear, as if anchoring himself to something real in a world that seemed to be dissolving around him. "Yes," he rasped finally. this is Malcolm. I've been thinking about that night, Eleanor said, her tone almost clinical, like she was dissecting a lab specimen rather than reaching out across a chasm. About you? Malcolm said nothing. His heart drummed a hard, erratic beat against his ribs. I ran your name, she continued, matter of fact. Looked into your work history. A flash of anger flared inside Malcolm, brief but hot. Of course she had. That was what people like her did. Peeling back your layers without permission, assuming that background checks were a courtesy when they were really a test. He straightened in the driver's seat, his hand tightening into a fist against the cracked vinyl. I didn't realize fixing a tire required a resume, Malcolm said, voice dry and razor-edged. Twisting a pause, and then, surprisingly, a chuckle, low and self-deprecating. Forgive me, Eleanor said. Old habits. But I saw something I couldn't ignore. Malcolm stared out at the blurry cityscape, the neon lights bleeding into puddles like bruises across the asphalt. And what exactly did you see? You, Eleanor answered simply. Not just someone desperate, someone capable. Another silence ballooned between them, this one less hostile, more fragile. My company, she went on, is expanding. I need skilled people, people I can trust. Your record at Wexler Automotive was impeccable. Malcolm's stomach twisted. Memories of the old shop, the sweat, the oil, the quiet pride of a job done right, flickered through him like ghost images. That life had collapsed under layoffs and foreclosures, leaving him scrambling ever since. And, he said cautiously, and I'm offering you a position, Eleanor said. Lead mechanic. 30-day probation period. You prove yourself, the job's yours permanently. Malcolm leaned his forehead against the cold window, letting the chill seep into him, trying to steady the whirlwind inside. You could hire anyone, he muttered. Someone cleaner, safer, whiter. There was a soft sigh on the other end. You're right, Eleanor said, but I'm not hiring you because of what you are. I'm hiring you because of what you can do. Her words hung in the darkness, glinting like small, stubborn stars. Malcolm looked back at Emma, her small chest rising and falling steadily under the threadbare blanket. He thought of the nights they had spent shivering, the hunger he had hidden from her, the desperate hope he carried like a cracked, leaking jar. What's the catch? He asked finally. You show up, you do the work, you don't quit. Simple words, but they settled in him with the weight of 1,000 promises broken by others. Malcolm exhaled, long and shaky. Then, almost without realizing, he reached out and placed his hand gently over Emma's, her fingers curling instinctively around his in her sleep. That small, automatic gesture was his answer. When do I start? He asked. Tomorrow, Eleanor said. 7 a.m. Bring your daughter. We have an on-set daycare. Malcolm let out a rough breath that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob. I'll be there. They ended the call, and for a long moment, Malcolm sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear as the rain battered the world around him. Then he turned slowly, reaching into the back seat. Carefully, he lifted Emma into his arms. She stirred, mumbling sleepily, but didn't wake fully. He held her close against his chest, feeling the fragile thud of her heart against his own. Stepping out into the storm, Malcolm tilted his face up to the sky and let the rain wash over him, mingling with the tears he no longer tried to hold back. For the first time in what felt like forever, the rain didn't feel like drowning. It felt like baptism. The morning broke reluctantly over Chicago, gray and sluggish, as if even the sun hesitated to touch the city. Malcolm stood outside the Hastings Automotive Complex, Emma's small hand curled tightly in his own. The massive glass building loomed over them, sleek, and impersonal, reflecting the dull sky like a promise too big to believe. He shifted the duffel bag on his shoulder, feeling the weight of everything he owned compressing into that one battered piece of luggage. Emma clung to his side, her backpack sagging with mismatched toys and a single worn blanket, the last relic of their old life. "You ready, Peanut?" Malcolm asked, forcing a smile. Emma nodded vigorously, though her fingers tightened around his. "Are you ready, Daddy?" Malcolm knelt, bringing himself eye level with her. He smoothed a wet curl from her forehead and smiled wider. The kind of smile that covered cracks but couldn't mend them. "I was born ready," he whispered. Together, they crossed the lot, their steps small but determined against the towering monolith ahead. Inside, the lobby gleamed with sterile perfection. Glass walls, polished concrete, minimalist furniture. Every inch designed to impress, to intimidate. Malcolm felt his jeans grow heavier, his boots dirtier with every step across the pristine floor. At the front desk, a receptionist glanced up, her gaze flickering over his appearance. Faded denim, fraying jacket, a little girl clutching a teddy bear missing an eye. Her smile was polite but tight. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said, voice clipped. Malcolm nodded. "Malcolm, and this is Emma." The woman's eyes lingered on Emma for a beat too long, then she picked up the phone and murmured into it. Moments later, Eleanor appeared. She was a storm contained. Hair pulled into a severe bun, navy slacks sharp enough to cut, expression impossible to read. She strode toward them with brisk efficiency, heels clicking sharply against the tile. "You're early," she said. "Good habits," Malcolm replied, adjusting his grip on Emma's hand. Eleanor's gaze softened almost imperceptibly when it fell on Emma. "The daycare is down that hall," she said, pointing. Malcolm crouched again, pressing his forehead lightly against Emma's. "You gonna be okay, Peanut?" Emma grinned, all bright resilience. "I'll make new friends." He watched her skip toward the daycare attendant, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and something inside him stretched taut, then snapped clean. Pride and fear braided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. Eleanor waited until Emma disappeared behind the glass doors before speaking again. "Walk with me," she said. They moved through the complex, past humming assembly lines and workers in matching coveralls. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and something sharper, ambition, maybe, or the fear of losing ground. "You'll be leading maintenance," Eleanor said without looking at him. "These machines cost millions. One failure can shut down the whole line." Malcolm nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. They entered a massive garage, cavernous and loud, where a group of men stood clustered near tool benches. Conversations stuttered and died as Malcolm entered, like a needle ripping off a record. "Everyone," Eleanor called, voice cutting clean through the tension. "This is Malcolm Reed. He'll be overseeing maintenance from today." There was a beat of silence, then a ripple of uneasy glances. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and grease-streaked coveralls stepped forward, arms crossed. "Thought we already had that covered," he drawled. Eleanor didn't blink. "Now we have it covered better." A few snickers, quickly muffled. The bearded man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Name's Marcus," he said, offering no hand. Malcolm nodded once, keeping his face neutral. Marcus's gaze slid over him, noting the worn boots, the second-hand jacket, the black skin beneath it all. His smirk was slow and knowing, like a wolf baring teeth through a yawn. Eleanor turned to Malcolm, crisp and efficient. "Get settled. You'll find your assignments in the office." She spun on her heel and walked away, leaving Malcolm standing alone under 1,000 unwelcome stares. He exhaled slowly, feeling the invisible weight pressing down. No speeches, no declarations, only work. The machines didn't care about the color of your skin. Malcolm squared his shoulders, moved toward the tool benches, and got to work. Malcolm threw himself into the work, burying every uneasy glance and whispered comment beneath the familiar rhythm of grease and steel. Machines were honest, in a way people rarely were. If you treated them right, they responded. If you made a mistake, they told you. They didn't lie, didn't judge. They broke, or they ran. His hands, rough and scarred from years under hoods and between gears, moved with a fluid certainty. He checked systems, recalibrated sensors, tightened bolts that had been lazily fastened by workers who never thought someone would bother to notice. He didn't look up when conversations died as he passed. He didn't flinch when Marcus and his circle made no effort to lower their voices when they mocked him. "New guy's taking inventory like he owns the damn place," Marcus sneered one afternoon, wiping his hands theatrically on a pristine rag. "Maybe he's planning to sell us piece by piece," another laughed, elbowing Marcus. Malcolm heard it all. He simply wiped the sweat from his brow, tightened the hydraulic seal on a conveyor arm, and moved on. The work was its own language, and Malcolm spoke it fluently, better than any of them knew. In the deep hum of the factory floor, he found a kind of armor, but armor only protected so much. Each day, the small cuts bled him a little more, the missing tools that should have been returned but mysteriously vanished, the slight misalignments left for him to catch, intentional sabotage disguised as carelessness. The way Marcus watched him, always with that coiled smirk, waiting for him to trip. Late one evening, as the last shift dwindled into a sullen quiet, Malcolm stood alone at one of the main presses, recalibrating the pressure gauges. His hands moved automatically, but his mind reeled. He thought of Emma, asleep in the daycare room, clutching the ragged bear they'd rescued from a dumpster behind a gas station. He thought of the motel room barely holding them above the tide of homelessness. He thought of how close, how terribly close, everything still was to collapse. A voice cut through the cavernous space. "You think fixing a few busted pipes makes you king of the hill?" Malcolm turned slowly. Marcus leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, a lazy grin playing on his lips. Around him, a few others lingered, their laughter like the hiss of leaking steam. Low, poisonous, waiting. Malcolm wiped his hands on a rag, tossing it onto the bench beside him. "I think doing the job right is the point," he said quietly. Marcus pushed off the bench with a casual stretch, sauntering closer until they were only a few feet apart. "Point is," he drawled, voice thick with contempt, "you don't belong here. You're a charity case. Everyone knows it." Behind him, someone chuckled. Another kicked the leg of a nearby stool, sending a loud clatter across the floor. Malcolm didn't move. His hands remained loose at his sides. But inside, a slow, hot tide was rising. Not rage. Not yet. But something heavier. Something forged from years of being looked at like he was a burden, an outsider, a threat. He took a breath, deep and deliberate. "You don't get to decide that," Malcolm said, his voice even, but carrying under the steel rafters. Marcus laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "The hell I don't? Guys like you? You're temporary." The words hit harder than a shove. But Malcolm stood his ground. He let the silence stretch until it grew heavy between them, until Marcus shifted slightly, unsure. Then Malcolm said low and steady, "I didn't walk through hell just to let a man like you block the door." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut deeper because they were true. For a long moment, Marcus just stared at him. Then, with a snort and a muttered curse, he turned away, swaggering back to his group. But the battle line had been drawn. From that moment, the war turned quieter, but sharper. Every task Malcolm touched seemed suddenly double-checked. Every success was met with narrowed eyes. Praise, when it came, was clipped and reluctant. And still, Malcolm endured. He was often the first to arrive, the last to leave, the one quietly tightening bolts that others had left loose, the one catching the tiny faults that could have grown into disasters. He built a fortress not from words, but from competence, from hours, from a resilience so stubborn it bordered on holy. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into his probation, a catastrophe threatened to detonate everything. The press line, the largest, most critical machine in the facility, ground to a sudden, jarring halt. Lights blinked furiously, alarms screamed, production froze. Workers scrambled like ants around a collapsed hill. Eleanor stormed onto the floor, flanked by engineers and managers barking orders into walkie-talkies. Malcolm was already moving. He bypassed the panic, slipped through the shouting, and dropped to his knees beside the press. The thundering in his ears wasn't fear, it was focus, pure and white-hot. He ran his hands along the machine's frame, feeling, listening, not just for vibrations, not just for heat, but for the language he knew these beasts spoke when something inside them broke. A whisper, a rattle, a breath too shallow or too rough. There, beneath the second chamber, a faint rhythmic stutter. He grabbed a wrench, ignoring the disbelieving looks shot his way. "You don't even know the system," someone barked. But Malcolm didn't answer. His hands moved faster, stripping away the lower panel. He found the problem like a hunter finds a wounded track, a cracked hydraulic line, barely visible behind layers of shielding. Minutes mattered. Every second the press lay silent cost the company thousands. Without hesitation, Malcolm ripped off his own jacket, wrapping the torn cloth tight around the compromised line to stanch the leak temporarily. Hydraulic fluid bled through the fabric, hot and slick. He tightened the makeshift seal with zip ties from his belt and slammed the panel back into place. "Restart sequence," he shouted, voice snapping like a whip across the stunned crowd. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eleanor nodded sharply. "Do it," she barked. Figures danced across the control panel. The press groaned, shuddered, and then roared back to life, belching steam but running, whole. The line workers erupted into stunned cheers. Even the managers gaped. Malcolm sat back on his heels, breathing hard, hydraulic fluid soaking into his shirt. Around him the chaos shifted from disaster to disbelief to reluctant awe. Eleanor stalked forward, eyes burning. "You just saved us 6 figures, she said, voice low and dangerous. Malcolm pushed himself to his feet, meeting her gaze steadily. "Was just doing the job," he said. Behind him, Marcus watched, expression thunderous. It was not the end of the war, but it was the first undeniable victory. The aftermath of the machine's resurrection rippled through Hastings Automotive like a stone dropped into still water. Malcolm could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, as he moved through the factory in the days that followed. The glances from his coworkers changed, not overnight but gradually, like frost retreating before a hesitant spring. Some of the younger mechanics began nodding at him in passing. A few even came to him quietly with questions they wouldn't dare ask their supervisors. Still, the shadows remained. Marcus was quieter now, but his silence felt heavier, coiled like a snake waiting for the right moment to strike. The others, the ones who had laughed with him, watched from a distance, their faces shuddered, unsure whether to retreat or regroup. Malcolm understood. Respect wasn't a gift here. It was a currency paid in sweat, scars, and resilience. He paid it without complaint. Each morning, he arrived before dawn, the sky still bruised purple. He'd sit in his truck, Emma dozing in the passenger seat, and watched the lights of the factory blink awake one by one. In those moments, he felt the brittle edge of something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. Or the dangerous cousin of hope, belief. Inside the garage, Malcolm attacked his work with a quiet ferocity. He double-checked every line, every bolt. He caught tiny cracks before they became failures. He treated each machine like it was the only thing standing between him and the storm still howling at the edges of his life. An evening, as he finished tightening a calibration plate, Eleanor appeared at the edge of the floor. She didn't call out. She just stood there, watching. Malcolm wiped his hands and approached her, his boots leaving damp prints on the concrete. "You wanted something, Miss Hart?" he asked, voice neutral. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and restless, studied him for a moment longer than necessary. "You're making it harder for them to ignore you," she said, almost as if accusing him. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Wasn't trying to make friends." Eleanor's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." For a long beat, they stood there, two survivors from different wars, measuring the distance between their battlegrounds. Then, quietly, Eleanor added, "You're doing good work. I notice." Malcolm's chest tightened unexpectedly, a flicker of something rising before he could kill it. Gratitude, raw and unfiltered. "Thank you," he said, the words foreign and heavy on his tongue. Eleanor nodded once, sharply, then turned and disappeared back into the maze of machinery. Later that night, Malcolm sat with Emma in the tiny motel room they called home. She was drawing with broken crayons on the back of a diner menu, humming to herself. Malcolm watched her, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. Emma looked up suddenly, eyes bright. "Did you fix a big machine today, Daddy?" He smiled, slow and tired, but real. "Yeah, Peanut, I did." Emma beamed, holding up a crayon drawing. A stick figure Malcolm beside a towering robot, both of them smiling. "You're a hero," she said solemnly. Malcolm leaned back against the wall, feeling something crack and shift inside him. Not pain, something warmer, something dangerously close to hope. He reached out, gently pulling her into his lap. "I'm just a man who doesn't quit," he whispered into her hair. Outside, the city roared and battered itself against the night. Inside, Malcolm held his daughter close, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could outrun the storm. Not because the world would make it easy, but because he would not stop moving forward. Because dignity, once claimed, was a fire no amount of silence could smother. And he was just getting started. The tension in the factory didn't vanish after Malcolm's victories. It merely shifted, sinking deeper, going quieter, like an underground current eroding the foundation of a bridge. Marcus hadn't forgotten. If anything, his smiles grew wider, more polite, more dangerous. Malcolm noticed. He noticed how Marcus no longer barked jokes in the open, but watched from a distance, scheming behind narrowed eyes. He noticed how sometimes tools he'd left neatly arranged would be mysteriously misplaced. How systems he'd double-checked would suddenly misfire under another man's hands. A setup was brewing. He could feel it, the way you feel a storm through your skin before the first cloud appears. And it came faster than he expected. Late one Friday afternoon, just before the end of shift, Eleanor's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. "Malcolm, read to line 2, now." The floor froze for half a second. Heads turned. Whispers hissed like steam vents. Malcolm wiped the grease from his hands, heart hammering against his ribs, and made his way across the concrete expanse. Line 2 was one of the most critical sections, a massive hydraulic system that pressed auto frames into shape with crushing force. If something went wrong here, It wasn't just downtime, it was danger. When he arrived, Eleanor stood with a clipboard, her mouth a hard line. Next to her, Marcus lounged against a workstation, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. The hydraulic arm on line 2 hung limp, a twisted piece of machinery where precision should have reigned. Eleanor's voice was flat, too calm. Incident report says the maintenance check signed off under your name missed a pressure fault. Malcolm stiffened. That wasn't possible. He'd checked it himself, twice. Behind him, the other workers drifted closer, drawn by the scent of blood. Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His satisfaction radiated like heat from a furnace. Malcolm forced himself to breathe, to think. "Permission to inspect," he said, voice level. Eleanor nodded sharply. Malcolm knelt by the machine, scanning it with practiced eyes. He moved methodically, tracing the lines, feeling the vibration, listening to the minute hum of the pressurized systems. And then he found it. A misaligned pressure valve, tiny but deliberate, so carefully tampered that it wouldn't fail immediately, but just soon enough to point back at him. He straightened slowly. He could feel the eyes burning into his back. If he accused Marcus now, in front of everyone, it would be his word against a dozen silent alliances. If he exploded, Marcus would win, painting him as the angry, unstable man everyone already half suspected he was. He closed his eyes for a breath. When he opened them, he turned to Eleanor, meeting her gaze head-on. "Found the problem," he said. "Sensor unit was manually miscalibrated." A murmur swept the gathered crowd. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your fault?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "No," he said, voice steady, "but the responsibility's still mine. I'll recalibrate it now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eleanor gave a tight nod. "Fix it," she said. Malcolm set to work immediately. He dismantled the sensor housing with precise, deliberate movements. His hands moved with the grace of a man threading a needle during an earthquake. In the background, Marcus watched, arms crossed, jaw tight. The recalibration took 15 minutes. When Malcolm finished, the machine hissed to life, smooth and perfect. Eleanor checked the pressure readouts herself. Then she turned to Malcolm. "You're clear," she said simply. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. In this place, survival was its own vindication. Malcolm wiped his hands on his jeans and turned toward the crowd. He locked eyes with Marcus, just for a moment, long enough for a silent promise to pass between them. "You will not break me." Marcus looked away first. Later that evening, Malcolm and Emma sat in the front seat of the truck parked outside the motel. The sun dipped low, bleeding burnt oranges and deep violet. Emma clutched a small paper cup of ice cream, her legs swinging happily. "Daddy?" she said between licks. "You look tired." Malcolm chuckled, low and rough. "Maybe a little." Emma studied him with wide, serious eyes. "But you still fight," she said, a statement, not a question. Malcolm turned toward her, the dying sunlight framing her face in gold. "Yeah, Peanut," he said, voice thick. "Some things are worth fighting for." He reached out, brushing a smear of chocolate from her cheek. For a moment it was just them, a man, a little girl, and the vast, brutal beauty of a city that didn't care if they lived or died. But Malcolm cared. And for Emma, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new traps. His silences filled with teeth. But tonight, for just a little while, Malcolm allowed himself the rarest luxury. Peace. The final days of Malcolm's probation unfolded like the slow unwinding of a clock wound too tight. Every second seemed stretched thinner than the last, vibrating with unseen tension. The factory itself felt suspended, as if holding its breath. Malcolm moved through the days with grim determination. He sharpened every action, every decision, into a blade honed against failure. He triple-checked his work. He triple-checked others' work. He bore the glances, the subtle sabotages, the shifting undercurrents of politics with a stoic calm that only sharpened the edges of his isolation. Emma became his anchor. Every evening, he would pick her up from the company daycare, and her smile, wide, gap-toothed, unbothered by the world's coldness, would stitch together the pieces the day had torn apart. "You're like a superhero," she'd told him once, swinging her legs in the truck seat. Malcolm had smiled quietly, one hand resting over hers. Not because he believed it, but because she did. That belief kept him standing. And so when the email arrived late on a Thursday night, simple, cold, almost sterile, it still hit him like a blow to the chest. Subject: employment status. Body: we are pleased to inform you. He stared at it for a long time, the words swimming through the tears he refused to let fall. He had made it. Not because they wanted him, not because they pitied him, but because he had refused to fail. The next morning, Malcolm stepped onto the factory floor as a full employee. No probation, no asterisk next to his name. And yet the air crackled sharper than ever. Marcus leaned against a forklift, arms crossed, watching him with a new kind of hatred. Quieter, colder. Malcolm didn't react. He crossed the floor toward his workstation, boots striking sparks against the concrete, shoulders squared as if carrying the invisible weight of every silent battle he'd fought to get here. Later that afternoon, Eleanor called him into her office. He entered, closing the door behind him. The room was minimal, clinical, a sleek desk, a wall of glass overlooking the factory, the city sprawling beyond like a steel and glass jungle. Eleanor sat behind the desk, tapping a pen against a folder. She didn't offer him a seat. "You're in," she said simply. Malcolm nodded once, acknowledging the fact without celebration. "You earned it," Eleanor continued, voice sharper now. "Not many could have." There was a pause, the kind of pause that wasn't empty, the kind heavy with something unsaid. Finally, Eleanor set down the pen and looked at him fully. "You know they're not done testing you," she said. Malcolm smiled, slow and tired. "They'll keep trying," he said. "But I don't break easy." Eleanor's mouth twitched into that almost smile again. "Good," she said, "because you're not just carrying yourself anymore." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward the daycare wing. "You're carrying her." Malcolm's throat tightened. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. She stood, extending her hand. For a moment, Malcolm hesitated, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood, fully and finally, that accepting that handshake wasn't just acceptance of a job. It was acceptance of everything that would come after. The battles, the loneliness, the silent weights he would carry until his back bent or broke. It was the weight of a single word. Yes. Malcolm reached out, gripping Eleanor's hand with a strength born of every night spent on cold floors, every morning fought with empty pockets, every moment he had chosen dignity over surrender. Her grip was firm, respectful, and in that handshake something passed between them, not friendship, not pity, but a grim acknowledgement of the war both had fought to stand where they stood. When he left the office, Malcolm didn't walk faster. He didn't smile, but his steps were heavier now, solid, deliberate. He was no longer moving just for survival. He was moving to claim something bigger, something no one could take from him again. And outside the factory, the cold wind howled against the walls, but inside, Malcolm Reed walked forward, carrying a fire that no storm could extinguish. The badge felt heavier in Malcolm's hand than he had expected. It wasn't just a piece of plastic and metal clipped to a lanyard. It was a declaration. A line drawn across everything he had fought, everything he had endured. Malcolm Reed, lead maintenance engineer, Hastings Automotive. He ran his thumb over the embossed letters, feeling each one like a scar, permanent, undeniable. Outside, Emma bounced on the balls of her feet, holding a crumpled piece of construction paper behind her back, her eyes alight with barely contained excitement. "Close your eyes, Daddy," she squealed. Malcolm chuckled, low and rough, and dutifully covered his eyes with one grease-stained hand. "Okay," he said, voice filled with mock seriousness. "I'm ready." He heard the rustle of paper, the hurried shuffle of tiny feet, and then, ta-da! Malcolm opened his eyes. Emma stood before him, holding up a drawing with both hands. It showed a tall stick figure wearing a badge, Malcolm, standing in front of a giant building labeled Hastings, with Emma, smaller, clutching his hand. Above them, in bright, bold letters, "My daddy is a boss." Malcolm felt something crack deep inside him, something that had been locked away for too long. He crouched down, gathering Emma into his arms, crushing the drawing gently between them. "You made this for me, Peanut?" he whispered. Emma nodded fiercely, burying her face into his chest. "You're the best fixer ever," she mumbled. Malcolm closed his eyes, breathing her in. The scent of crayons and hope and everything he fought for. Later, after tucking Emma into the motel bed and listening to her breathing even out into the deep rhythm of childhood sleep, Malcolm sat alone by the window, the badge hanging around his neck. He stared out at the city, a sprawl of bruised lights and broken dreams stitched together with asphalt and steel. Tomorrow, there would be more battles. Marcus would not forget. Neither would the quiet systems built to keep men like Malcolm in their place, smiling politely while cutting the legs from under him. But tonight, Malcolm allowed himself to sit still, to feel the quiet weight of dignity finally earned. He unclipped the badge, holding it up to the flickering motel lamp. The letters gleamed dully, each one a brand hammered into the future he was building, not just for himself, but for Emma. A knock rapped quietly at the door. Malcolm tensed instinctively, setting the badge down and rising silently. He cracked the door open. Eleanor stood there, dressed down for once, jeans, a dark jacket, hair loose around her face. She held 2 cups of coffee, steam curling into the cold night air. "Truce offering," she said dryly, lifting 1 cup. Malcolm smiled, surprised. He stepped aside, letting her in. They sat by the window, 2 battered warriors sharing the spoils of a battle no one else could see. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Eleanor said, voice softer than he had ever heard it, "You did more than survive, Malcolm." He turned, studying her under the yellow motel light. "You changed something," she said, "even if they don't say it." Malcolm looked down at the badge resting against his chest. "Changing something," he murmured, "doesn't mean they'll stop fighting you." Eleanor shrugged slightly. "Maybe not, but now you fight from higher ground." A shadow of a smile touched his lips. He sipped the coffee, cheap, burned, perfect, and let the heat burn the bitterness from his throat. "You ever get tired?" he asked suddenly, voice low. Eleanor's eyes darkened for a heartbeat. "Every damn day," she said. They shared a long, understanding silence. Outside, the city shivered in its neon skin, but inside the small, battered room, Malcolm Reed sat surrounded by something rare, something holy. Not victory, not safety, but presence. Tomorrow would bring new storms, new ambushes, new betrayals wrapped in smiles. But tonight, His name, etched in metal and backed by blood, sweat, and soul, was enough. Tomorrow, he would carry it like a shield. Tonight, he let it simply be a crumb. In the soft hush of an early morning, Malcolm Reed stood quietly beside the assembly line, his calloused fingers brushing over a newly repaired machine. No applause echoed, no cameras flashed, just the steady rhythm of life, rebuilt one silent choice at a time. Strength wasn't always in the battles fought loudly. Sometimes it lived in the dignity of showing up again and again, even when no one watched. Beyond that moment, a harder road awaited. The slow reconstruction of trust, dignity, and space for voices like his and Emma's to exist freely. In the quiet hum of metal and hope, Malcolm understood survival was only the beginning. True justice would take patience, stubborn kindness, and a relentless memory unwilling to forget the quiet injustices suffered. In life, not every victory is marked by a grand celebration. Sometimes it's the silent standing, the refusal to give up when it would be easier to vanish, that becomes the truest measure of strength. Malcolm's journey reminds us that dignity is not gifted by others. It is claimed, quietly and daily, often without recognition. For those of us who have seen decades pass, who know the weight of silence and the endurance it demands, his story offers a soft but unyielding truth. Justice begins not with shouting, but with remembering. Remembering who we are. Remembering who was pushed aside. Remembering that no small act of survival is ever truly small. Let us carry these memories, these truths, and these hopes forward, with gentleness, with fire, and with the unwavering belief that dignity, once claimed, transforms not just one life, but every life it touches. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Unheard Racist Stories, to listen, to remember, and to share. Every voice you help amplify is another step toward a kinder, fairer world. Thank you for being part of this journey. We can't wait to walk the next road with you.